Who was Solon? Solon of Athens, circa 638 to circa 558 BC, was an Athenian statesman, lawmaker, and poet. He tried to legislate against moral decline, political and economic situations, and stances in archaic Athens, although he was largely unsuccessful in the short term. He is still attributed as laying down the foundations of Athenian democracy. He wrote poetry, typically in patriotic propagandist prose, and in defense of his beliefs in constitutional reform. Modern knowledge of Solon is limited by the fact that his works only survive in fragments and appear to feature interpolations by later authors, and by the general paucity of documentary and archaeological evidence covering Athens in the early 6th century BC. Ancient authors such as Herodotus and Plutarch are the main source of information, yet they wrote about Solon long after his death, at a time when history was by no means an academic discipline. Solon was a native of Athens, being born most likely by Execestides, who would have made him distinguished in Attica for being associated with the Eupatrid clan, although his family most likely had moderate wealth. Megara was one of the 4 districts of Attica, embodied in the 4 mythic sons of King Pandion II, of whom Nisos was the ruler of Megara. Megara was also a trade port, its people using their ships and wealth as a way to gain leverage on armies of neighboring polis. It is due just west of Athens. The Megarian school of philosophy, which flourished in the 4th century BC, was founded by Euclides of Megara, one of the pupils of Socrates. Its ethical teachings were derived from Socrates, recognizing a single good, which was apparently combined with the Eleatic doctrine of unity. When Athens and Megara were contesting for the possession of Salamis Island, Solon was given leadership of the Athenian forces. After repeated disasters, Solon was able to increase the morale and spirits of his body of troops on the strength of a poem he wrote about the islands. Supported by Pisistratus, he defeated the Megarians either by means of cunning tricks or more directly through heroic battle around 595 BC. The Megarians, however, refused to give up their claim to the island. This caused enough of a problem to be referred to the Spartans, who eventually awarded possession of the island to Athens on the strength of the case that Solon put to them. According to Diogenes Laertius in 594 BC, Solon was chosen archon, or chief magistrate. As archon, Solon discussed his intended reforms with some friends. The early 6th century was a troubled time for the Athenians in other ways as well. Society was dominated by an aristocracy of birth. The Eupatridae, who owned the best land, monopolized the government and were themselves split into rival factions. The poorer farmers were easily driven into debt by them, and when unable to pay, were reduced to the condition of serfs on their own land, and in extreme cases sold into slavery. The intermediate classes of middling farmers, craftsmen, and merchants resented their exclusion from the government. These social, economic, and political evils might well have culminated in a revolution and subsequent tyranny, dictatorship, as they had in other Greek states, had it not been for Solon, to whom Athenians of all classes turned in the hope of a generally satisfactory solution of their problems. Because he believed in moderation and in an ordered society in which each class had its proper place and function, his solution was not revolution, but reform. In one of Solon's poems he says, "These things the black earth could best witness for the judgment of posterity, from whose surface I plucked up the marking stones, probably signs of the farmer's indebtedness, planted all about, so that she who was enslaved is now free. And I brought back to Athens many who had been sold, justly or unjustly, or who had fled under the constraint of debt, wandering far afield, and no longer speaking the Attic tongue. And I freed those who suffered shameful slavery here and trembled at their master's whims." Knowing that he was about to cancel all debt, Solon's friends took out loans and promptly bought some land. Suspected of complicity, Solon complied with his own law and released his own debtors, amounting to 5 talents or 15 according to some sources. His friends never repaid their debts. Poverty, though not eliminated, was never again in Attica the crying evil that it had been before Solon's reforms. Solon's next great contribution to the future good of Athens was his new code of laws. The first written code at Athens, that of Draco circa 621 BCE, was still in force. Draco's laws were shockingly severe, hence the term draconian, so severe that they were said to have been written not in ink but in blood. On the civil side, they permitted enslavement for debt, and death seems to have been the penalty for almost all criminal offenses. Solon revised every statute except that on homicide and made Athenian law altogether more humane. His code, though supplemented and modified, remained the foundation of Athenian statute law until the end of the 5th century, and parts of it were embodied and the new codification made at that time. In attempting to satisfy all, he had satisfied none. Solon, although concerned for freedom, justice, and humanity, was no egalitarian, nor had he any ambition for autocratic power. Though discontented, the Athenians stood by their promise to accept Solon's dispositions. They were given validity for 100 years, according to Plutarch, and posted for all to see on revolving wooden tablets, to avoid having to defend and explain them further. However, Herodotus seemed to suggest that their validity was for only 10 years, which would have made more sense. After he had finished his reforms, he traveled abroad for 10 years so that the Athenians could not induce him to repeal any of his laws. He did this most likely to escape persecution from the tyrannist Pisistratus. This is similar to getting out of one jurisdiction and into another to escape custody. His first stop was Egypt. There, according to Herodotus, he visited the Pharaoh of Egypt, Amasis II. According to Plutarch, he spent some time and discussed philosophy with two Egyptian priests, Xenophus of Heliopolis and Sonkis of Sais. A very aged priest tells him that 9,000 years earlier, Athens had been in conflict with the great power of Atlantis, which was then destroyed in a catastrophe. Plato's dialogue does not mention a name for the priest, but Plutarch, 46-120 Anno Domini, in his Life of Solon, identified the aged priest as Sonkis. Near Nilus's mouth, by fair Canopus's shores, and spent some time in study with Xenophus of Heliopolis and Sonkis the Saite, the most learned of all the priests, from whom, as Plato says, getting knowledge of the Atlantic story, he put it into a poem and proposed to bring it to the knowledge of the Greeks. Plutarch gives a more detailed description on the Greek philosophers who visited Egypt and received advice by the Egyptian priests in his book on Isis and Osiris. Thus, Thales, Eudoxus, Solon, Pythagoras, some say Lycurgus also, and Plato traveled into Egypt and conversed with the priests. Eudoxus was instructed by Conufius of Memphis, Solon by Sonkis of Sais, and Pythagoras by Ouenufus of Heliopolis. If anybody is familiar with the ancient mystery schools, this would have been the time that Solon was undoubtedly introduced into them, among them the knowledge of the craft of Freemasonry or Rosicrucianism being the most popular. According to Plato's dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he visited Neith's temple at Sais and received from the priests there an account of the history of Atlantis. Next, Solon sailed to Cyprus, where he oversaw the construction of a new capital for a local king, in gratitude for which he named it Soloi. Solon's travels finally brought him to Sardis, capital of Lydia. According to Herodotus and Plutarch, he met with Croesus and gave the Lydian king advice, which Croesus failed to appreciate until it was too late. Croesus had considered himself to be the happiest man alive, and Solon had advised him, "Count no man happy until he be dead." The reasoning was that at any minute fortune might turn on even the happiest man and make his life miserable. It was only after he had lost his kingdom to the Persian king Cyrus, while awaiting execution, that Croesus acknowledged the wisdom of Solon's advice. When Solon returned to Athens, he found the citizens divided into regional factions headed by prominent nobles. Of these, his friend Pisistratus, general in the final war for Salamis and leader of northeastern Attica, seemed to Solon to be planning to become tyrant. The old statesman's urgent warnings were disregarded, even dismissed as the ravings of a madman. His reply was that, "A little time will show the citizens my madness. Yes, will show, when truth comes in our midst." Solon became a staunch opponent of Pisistratus. In protest, and as an example to others, Solon stood outside his own home in full armor, urging all who passed to resist the machinations of the would-be tyrant. It was not long before he was proved right. Pisistratus did become tyrant, 560 BCE. Although on this occasion he was soon ejected, it seems that Solon did not live to see it and his efforts were in vain. Solon died shortly after Pisistratus was usurped by the force of the autocratic power that Athens had once freely bestowed upon him. Solon died in Cyprus at the age of 80 around circa 560 BCE, and in accordance with his will his ashes were scattered around Salamis, the island where he was born. The travel writer Pausanias listed Solon among the 7 sages whose aphorism, "Nothing in excess," adorned Apollo's temple in Delphi.